in them, rather than this balking, moaning, whining, there are things I haven't got in my life. Because we can all play that. It's an absolutely unending game. That's why I tell people, don't play the privilege game. You can't play it. You could discover an earl in Britain with a castle of their own, who you would say that's the most privileged person, and they could have led a hell of a life. You have no idea. And as I say, don't. I just want to tell people, don't play games that cannot be won.
Well, this does raise the question. I mean, you talk about various sorts of group identity here, and I will say it seems to me that some of the group identities that have been formed responsibly. So, for example, racial group identity in the United States, in many cases that was formed, to be fair, in response to actual racial oppression. So if you say, I identify as a black person in the United States, and you're talking about growing up in the 1960s, that makes perfect sense, considering that there was an active attempt to oppress you and prevent you from taking part in sort of the ladders of opportunity that you're talking about. But we've now shifted the discussion from you're part of a group that is being put upon to we're going to redefine reality so as to create new groups. And this is where you move into sort of the trans identity issue. So now, if you are a man who is a biological male who believes that you are a woman, we are going to label you as part of a separate group who are actually women. And if people refuse to change the science in order to meet your expectation of what you wish you were, then you are now an oppressed group of people, just like black Americans were oppressed in the 1960s by Jim Crow.
Well, I mean, there's several things to say. I mean, one is that, of course, to say that these things are going on illegitimately now is obviously not to say there wasn't legitimacy in the past. I mean, I'd be an idiot who claimed there hasn't been racism or sexism or homophobia or transphobia, for that matter. But to say that was that has existed in the past, and to say as a result we should be fighting this battle not just in the same manner, but actually in a more vociferous manner in many ways today, is, I think, one of the reasons why this has been so divisive. I mean, there are things that fourth wave feminists say that the suffragettes would never have dreamt of saying. Like, can you imagine the suffragettes a century ago trying to persuade people to give women the vote? Can you imagine how far they'd have got if they'd have adopted "kill all men" as their slogan, as fourth wave feminists had? Like, how about the Pankhursts and others had gone around with placards saying "men are trash," to use another fourth wave feminist slogan? How many men do you think they'd have got on their side in that? So why are the fourth wave feminists much, much worse in their arguments and much more vociferous and bitter and ugly than people were 100 years ago when they had something legitimate to say about this? I say this in The Madness for Crowds. Why does Ta-Nehisi Coates come across as far more bitter and negative about America than James Baldwin, who's the writer? He was furious when somebody said, he wasn't. Ta-Nehisi Coates would love to be James Baldwin. He ain't James Baldwin. And there's a reason in a way, which is that James Baldwin, among other things, has extraordinary moral imagination and a consideration about forgiveness and much more. And I'm just amazed that people don't see that the thing has gone off the rails, because at the stage where things have never been better, they are led by and asked to look up to people who present the situation as if it's never been worse. And I think in a way that just vindicates, I think, was it Thomas Sowell who said that thing about, all rights movements starting off as a legitimate cause, becoming a business and ending up as a racket. There's something in that. But we are being divided by these people, I think, in a way that just has to be called out. They are, again, they're making unfair claims about our societies. And that does raise this question, of course, of how do you know when to stop? And I see this all the time in the LGBT bit of this, which is the only crampon I can claim to have on the social justice marathon wall. And I'm just fascinated by the people who sort of, who don't know that it's over, basically, because they've got a business on the back of it. They've got a racket going. They want to protect it. they're reduced to making stuff up, making up false claims and exaggerating and things, just because otherwise they've got nothing to do. And I did always think this, that all of these social justice movements were in some way the product of boredom and excessive wealth, excessive comfort. I mean, it's only if you've got nothing to complain about that you can possibly think the world would give a damn about a microaggression.
So I wanted to ask you, Douglas, about the media in Britain versus the media in the United States, because you've written pretty extensively about the differences between media in both countries. It's sort of fascinating. The United States, obviously, we have very broad free speech rules, much broader than the free speech rules in Britain. But at the same time, our media seem to be significantly more censorious, significantly more welcoming toward opinions masquerading as objective journalism. Can you give us sort of a rundown on the differences between British media and American media in this way?
Yeah, I mean, whenever I'm in America and absorb a lot of American media, it makes me value the BBC, which I have plenty of criticisms of. But I do think that there have been several things that have happened in American media in recent years, which have been very much the negative. I mean, I think the main thing is we don't really have the sort of creations you have there of people who are, for instance, in front of the camera and expected to explain a worldview for a willing, waiting audience. Our news programs in particular, mainly because of impartiality rules, you have to sort of demonstrate impartiality, which is, something we go, but it's there as an aspiration, shall we say, in British broadcasting. You can't just go on air and, as a presenter, say stuff. You have to counterbalance and much more. Now, of course, there's a problem with that. The problem of the balance issue in British broadcasting is when you have, and it does happen, you have somebody, I don't know, for instance, it happens a lot on the Israel one. You get somebody from, who's a sort of moderate leftist analyst of Israeli affairs. And because they recognize, the Israeli government, you have to balance them out with, Abu Jihad, from the, Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, and so there's this weird idea that's the balance of the debate. And I'm afraid that does happen on quite a lot of things. And it negatively impacts our understanding of a range of issues. So there is a problem to this balance thing, but it does save us from, having. What is it I saw recently? Don Lemon starting his show by just saying, and he named I think it was after the all countries comment to President Trump. Don Lemon goes on and he says, it's whatever the date is, and the president of the United States is a racist. Like, you couldn't do that in British broadcasting. You can't just go on air as a presenter and say stuff. And I think that has had a hugely negative effect in America. And I think the worst thing, by the way, is this thing of two sides that talk about each other and never to each other. The left says, the thing about conservatives is, and the right says, the thing about the left is, and I just think it'll make things a lot worse, as my own opinion. But
I mean, I've had this experience personally, actually, obviously, being from America and dealing almost solely with American media. When I was on BBC with Andrew Neil and had no clue who he was, and he was just playing devil's advocate with me or taking a skeptical point of view, I had no understanding that that's actually his job, is to basically just play the other side to whomever he's interviewing. And so my core assumption was, if somebody is going to be speaking to me that way, then it's because they are representing their actual viewpoint, which is the way that it works in the United States.
Yes. I had that quite early on in my career. I had a news night once with a legendary broadcaster called Jeremy Paxman. Jeremy Paxman asked me a question. I did, I sort of find it, and he seemed to like what I said, and I sort of feeling rather smug, and he laid into the other guy, and I was actually making the mistake of sort of sitting there vaguely smiling, and Jeremy Paxton then wheeled around to me, and so I said, "What are you smiling at?" and then attacked me on something, and I thought it was a good lesson early on that the presenter's just never on your side in British TV.
So with that said, let's turn to British politics and the media treatment of Boris Johnson. So obviously in the United States, the media treatment of President Trump is 107% negative. There has yet to be a broadcaster in the United States outside of Fox News who voted for President Trump, who even thinks that President Trump is a breathing, sentient human being as opposed to just a bad orange giant with minimal hand size. So how has the media treatment been of Boris Johnson in Britain?
There is some similarity in the treatment. There has been an attempt to pretend that Boris Johnson is some appalling, divisive figure, and so on. It doesn't actually work. I have to say, one of the reasons is that actually, in conservative terms, Boris Johnson is very liberal, and I mean this in a way in the American and the British sense of the understanding of that term. His instincts are deeply liberal in the true classical sense, and he's certainly not some authoritarian figure. He was enormously successful by being elected twice as the mayor of London in a Labour voting city. He twice took that position for the Conservative Party, so he's obviously able to attract crossover votes. By leading the Brexit campaign, the Leave campaign in 2016, and that being successful, a lot of people who did like him or had time for him definitely turned against him. He definitely took the brunt for a long time with the negative fallout that did come from people who were furious about the Brexit vote. But by and large, I would say that he enjoys some better press in the UK, certainly, than President Trump does in the US, and I think there's lots of reasons for that. But one of them is just the fact that the suppurating sore that we've had under British politics in recent years has been addressed now. I mean, I was very, very worried for my country in recent years, much as I have been for America in this era, because it did seem to me that having voted to leave the EU in 2016, we had such pushback, all the same things that were done in the US after the Trump vote. The voters are racist, the voters are sexist, the voters are misogynist, the voters are homophobic. They are voting for an increase in hate crime. They're carrying out hate crimes, and much more. We had all of that before it was done in the States as this massive playback to punish the voters. And I worried that era was not going to end. By actually taking control of the Conservative Party finally and leading the UK out of the EU, it seems to me that terrible sore has finally been lanced, and that it's meant that although there are some people who just want to replay 2016 forever, by and large, people have now progressed through the various stages of grief. And that while there were people who were stuck on the second or third stage, they were still bargaining, they were still pleading. I know that people voted to leave the EU, but perhaps we can beg them not to, or get it back, or... By and large, those people have passed through the stages of grief now and have realized that we've got to make the best job of where we are, whether you were for leaving or for remain. And so in a better position on that. And I just add one thing, which is that throughout this coronavirus, it is striking to me that there has been much more public support and unanimity for the government's stance here because it's Boris Johnson. I mean, I can assure you, as a fairly vocal critic of Jeremy Corbyn, who was the Labour Party leader until earlier this year. If Jeremy Corbyn had won the election in December, and Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott, would have been his Home Secretary, had told me to confine myself to my house and never leave again, I'm not sure I'd have agreed to do it. I'd been very suspicious of it. I'd have thought it was very personal, apart from anything else. But no, I don't think that is. I think there's reason why we have a certain amount of trust in Boris Johnson in a way that in America, as I say, you just have this totally bifurcated nation still.
So I touched on it a little bit earlier, but I was wondering if maybe you could explicate for folks in the United States who are on the right side of the aisle, the differences between sort of British conservatism and American conservatism. In American conservatism, there's been this real drive for smaller government, a more libertarian view of society. In British conservatism, what are the animating forces behind British conservatism that separate them on the one hand from sort of the Labour Party and on the other hand from American conservatives?
The truth is that in many ways, British conservatives would be seen as pretty left-wing by their American counterparts. And I've seen it all my life. I mean, there is a very clear difference in drive between